time is really a deep and complicated notion, but on a superficial level, we measure time in units like weeks, days, years, hours, and I want to examine some decades. And of course, in musical parlance, we talk a lot about decades. We mentioned the 50s, 70s, 60s, and so on. And I want to examine more than the decade itself, the years that end or begin the decades. So 60s, 70s, 80s, 50s, 90s, from that perspective. And of course, from a point of view of rock and roll, it really starts in somewhere in the 60s. So the first one I would like to examine is the year 60 versus 70, but I want to give a little nod to the 50s, because music, of course, didn't start in the 60s. Music started thousands of years ago, but popular music as we know it, we can push it as far back as the beginning of the 20th century. There will be some historians that will say that the Delta blues really originated already in the late 19th century, and there is some truth to that. So there was some semblance of what we call today Delta blues in the late 19th century, although it really started to proliferate in the 20s, and other things also from a technological perspective, society, economics change, and of course shape the way that we consume, that we listen to music. So before we go into 60 versus 70, let's take a look about 1950. Who releases records in 1950? Of course, we have mostly jazz artists, and what really happened in 50, not in 50 per se, but actually in the late 40s, 47, 48, something like that, is that the 33 RPM record as we know it today was introduced. In fact, an earlier version, actually very similar, almost identical version to the 33 RPM, was introduced in the early 30s, something like to the effect of 31, 32 maybe, but it was not yet commercially viable. And I think that even the public didn't demand recorded music that much. Recorded music, of course, existed, but music in general was understood as live performances. So recordings were done in order to broadcast them from radio stations. That was the bulk of recordings. So they were not really meant for individual home use that much. People listened to music at home via radio for the most part. Those who did listen to it, but still live music dominated. That didn't catch on in the early 30s for various reasons. Like I said, economy, society, and especially technology wasn't really ready for that. The apparatus was a little bit cumbersome and clumsy and big and of course expensive, and there weren't that many records pressed, so the recording industry remained with the 78 RPM on gramophones. And that's actually where the notion of album comes from, because you can only put something along the lines of 6, maybe 8 minutes on the side of a 78 RPM, and a typical classical work lasts something around an hour, maybe a little bit less, 40 minutes to an hour. And so it needed something around like 8 to 10 records, and so they used to put them in a binder that you would flip the pages like a book, and that's why they called it album. So there you have it, and the name stuck. But the word album nowadays is mostly associated with a regular 33 RPM 12-inch record, but of course it continued on to the cassette and CD times or periods. Anyway, 1950, who releases records? Artists like Dave Brubeck, Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, and of course Robert Johnson. And early Delta blues artists had some 78 RPMs beforehand. Robert Johnson died in the 30s, and all he recorded in his entire life, he was very young when he died, I think he didn't even make it to 30, was 3 albumfuls, enough material for 3 albums, what was explicitly recorded for dissemination. And there were a couple 78s, and even the re-releases on 33.5 RPM, the 33 and a third, I'm sorry, didn't start until the 60s. So that was the situation in 50. In 60, there was a much wider breadth of artists, but let's mention those who did release in 50. In 60, Frank Sinatra again releases an album in 60. So does Bing Crosby. Joan Baez comes onto the scene. Definitely not rock, but it's not, although her music is often mentioned as folk or American folk, it's not really folk in the very, very typical or very conservative perspective. So definitely has a more popular and commercial feel to it, at least for the times. Ray Charles bursts on the scene. He already released, I think, in the late 50s, but definitely releases an album in 1960. Miles Davis, who's been recording, he probably been recording from the late 40s even, but early 50s for sure. I'm not really into his material from before that, but in 1960 he releases Sketches of Spain, which is the record that came out after Around Midnight. That's the one that made him really famous, in my opinion. It's not a great record, not really impressive that much. But again, we're talking about years right now. Elvis Presley, of course, became big in the mid 50s, and he does release at least one record in 1960, maybe two, if I am not mistaken. Or it was one record and one. He did all kind of different things like soundtracks and things of that nature. So Elvis is back. I think is the record from 1960. Bo Diddley, who was sort of straddling the rock, pop, rockabilly, rock and roll. Chuck Berry releases a record in 1960. Muddy Waters does. Muddy Waters released, I think, a live record live at Newport in 1960, and also a studio recording. But the studio recording might have preceded his live record from Newport 1960, but he's been performing and playing for a long time before that. He might have recorded under his own name, maybe he recorded with other people, or it wasn't recorded, like I said, explicitly for commercial dissemination, but more like a performer. But in 1960 he definitely releases a live album, and I'm almost positive that a studio recording as well under his own name. And that pretty much sums it up. So let's take a look at 1970 versus 1960. We'll touch a little bit about what's going on in the middle, because we shouldn't ignore that as well. But again, Frank Sinatra again releases a record in 1970. Good. Same thing Bing Crosby. Same thing Joan Baez. Same thing Ray Charles. Miles releases Bitches Brew. That's the big one. That's the one with John McLaughlin. Phenomenal record. And then a decade later, he started working with Marcus Miller. That's not a very different story, but definitely another story. The one before Bitches Brew in '69, I forget the title right now. That's the one that has kind of a French vibe in it, in the title and the names of the songs. Not yet as beboppy or going actually into fusion that much, but taking a turn a little bit toward that mentality or that idea. So great Miles Davis record. Cliff Richard actually also started to be kind of like a rock pop kind of thing, or maybe rock-ish, more rock-ish pop. And he did have a record in 1960 as well as in 1970, if I'm not mistaken. Could have just been a soundtrack, so maybe it's not a pre-planned or a explicit studio recording. Bo Diddley again records and releases in 1970 Chuck Berry does release a record in 1970. Muddy Waters didn't. He released studio recordings in 69 and 71. And now we've had The Mirror. So we see that pretty much all of the artists that released in 60 also released in 70. And of course, Elvis, I should have mentioned, he also recorded a studio album. Who bursts on the scene, who was hitherto unknown? Now let's remember that in 1960 we're talking about a pre-Slade world, a pre-T-Rex world, a pre-Animals, pre-Rolling Stones, what's the name of that little band, the Beatles, pre-The Who, pre-The Animals. Some of these bands came and went before 70 turned around, right? The Animals did not record a new record in 1970, so they were pretty much done. Same thing, the Yardbirds, they recorded between 60 and by 70, I think it was gone. They did some kind of comebacks in the 90s and the 2000s, but they were gone. So who's bursting on a scene? In rock, Deep Purple, phenomenal, iconic record. Again, they started a couple of years prior to that. You have Black Sabbath with their first record, Black Sabbath, and then Paranoid, both released in 1970. Amazing records. You got Led Zeppelin 3, which a lot of Led Zeppelin fans consider to be the best. I like the second one most, but again, very, very influential and important record, right, from a rock and roll perspective. Uriah Heep releases their first record, very heavy, very humble. Great band, great new idea. What else do we have? Pink Floyd comes out with Atom Heart Mother. In the Wake of Poseidon, King Crimson, second record, released in 1970. John Mayall, interesting. John Mayall didn't release in 1960. He was old enough. I think in 1960 he was either 30 or pushing 30, and he was already playing. He was a musician by then, but he did not record music on his own. His first record is the Beano album, right, with the Blues Breakers, and then came the one with Greenie, A Hard Road. But in 1970, he continued what he started in '69. That crazy concept of recording a record without drums, The Turning Point. Phenomenal record, and he tried to replicate that, but at least in my opinion, with much less success. In 1970, he releases two records. One is USA Reunion, and the second one, I can't remember the name right now. Empty Rooms, maybe, but it could be a Gary Moore song popped into my head. I think it is called Empty Spaces or Empty Rooms, if I'm not mistaken. Genesis releases their second record, Trespass. Yes, the same thing, Time and Word. Wishbone Ash comes out with their first record, UFO 1, right? That's already kind of pretty. UFO was pretty hard for the times, right? Pretty hard rocking. Jethro Tull releases Benefit, their third record. Phenomenal, great record, and fairly often cited as a favorite Jethro Tull record for many fans. Yes, of course, Aqualung and Thick as a Brick are typically dominating and mentioned as the best Jethro Tull records, but Benefit is definitely not far behind. I happen to like it better than those two in general. So there we go. Fleetwood Mac. Yeah, I had to slip in some Peter Green in there. There's no more Fleetwood Mac with Peter Green. By 70 he left, and they released Kiln House, which is still before Lindsey Buckingham. So this is a Bob Welch and Danny Kirwan record. I think they maintained that lineup for a number of records. 71, 2, 3. I think Penguin they released with the same lineup. So it's a pretty good record. It's definitely took a sharp turn from what they did with Greenie. Actually, Greenie did come back for a series of records for a series of concerts in February 1970. It's been released as originally as Boston Tea Party, but it was not released until the mid 80s, 85 or 84. it came out, and then in the 2000s someone found the original recording and repressed them and sold it as a kind of like a box set. I think it's 3 CDs or 4 CDs and 6 records, 3 double records, that they could have condensed it a little bit. They put very little programming, at least on the LPs, and if I remember correctly, same thing on the CD. So there you have it. You have it 60 versus 70, and 1960 was a world still without all of the big bands that we know, like I said, like the Animals, the Who, the Stones, Beatles, the Yardbirds, Slade, T-Rex, and so on and so forth. I think Slade and T-Rex both released records in 1970. They weren't. Maybe T-Rex was the first record. I'm not. No, T-Rex recorded already in the late 60s, as well as Slade. So there we go, and. We've looked at 1970 versus 1960. We mentioned briefly 1950, a little bit the decade between them. And of course, next time we will examine 1980 versus 1970. And until then, don't forget to just rock on and on and on.